Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. Welcome to part 2 of the Dan and Ed Travel the World extravaganza. Last week, they told us about their trip through Africa. This week, they're going to tell us all about their time through Europe and Asia and Russia. I think. Don't actually know. Bring it on!
We went east, is the best way of putting it, really. I think we started off the first trip going south, broadly speaking, and we found that south was pretty good, had a good time. We were hankering for another direction, so we chose east.
Would it be true to say you did the long way down and then you did the long way around?
Yes. So one of the inspirations for the long way down, for me, would have been the long way round, if that makes sense, because the research for that and kind of knowing about that trip kind of spurred me on to doing understanding the trip. So when we then went east, I took the long way round with me. Not so much, I didn't think so much as a source, because the route that we took wasn't quite the same, except later on maybe, but more as a sort of an inspiration, kind of not like a Bible, but like a sort of a talisman or something to kind of keep me entertained as we went along, and maybe as a comparator, because I think there was always the discussions about, oh, you're just doing the Charlie Ewan thing, or which I never really felt like we were trying to ape anything like that. It was just they had done something that was a kind of some evidence, if you like, something like a source to review and to take from it what we would. I mean, I think going back to why east as well. So when we arrived back from the first trip, obviously we went off and did our own things for a bit. And from my perspective, I started following a bunch of Polish guys who had been doing the kind of the east route and had lots of experience in Mongolia and stuff. They're called the Moto Siberia crew. There were four of them. And their trips started ramping up and got more and more challenging, if you like. So their idea was to go, obviously, to try and go all the way east. I think the trip for me was a little bit more of an experiment on the first trip. It was like an iteration. So the first one, it was kind of just make it through with what we thought we needed at the time. The second trip was like, let's turn up the volume a little bit. Let's go to the other extreme in terms of what's the minimum you think you need. So we're looking at small bikes, because that was always the criticism with taking the big bikes, is that you'd get to something interesting, but you could never really turn up the excitement level, because you're hulking this huge, great big, over 200 kilo Africa Twin setup around at the time.
Did you actually become conscious of that then on the first trip, or was it just a thought process afterwards?
It was always there, I think, because we always had a great adventure whenever we took those bikes off-road, but we often had a third person to help us out. And actually the most fun we maybe had on them was when we didn't have the luggage on them, which sort of tells you everything really about it. As the weight that sometimes in South Africa we took off the luggage and we just went around quite lightweight and just on the bikes, like driving around. And an Africa Twin with no luggage versus one with a full hard pannier is like a dirt bike compared to a Goldwing. Suddenly you're like, this is great fun. Like, this is what I want to be doing. Not so much of the big heavy bike stuff. And also you're just conscious that, it was always fun, but a bit challenging when you took these things into the unpredictable. Thankfully, we mostly made it through. Every time I got a bit excited on the Africa Twin, I would usually either bump into a bit of scenery, bump into some bloke on a moped somewhere in Namibia. Yeah, basically bump into something. And that's really testament to just trying to go a bit too maybe fast on the big bike, trying to, taking things for granted maybe, and just getting a bit carried away.
Was there much debate between the two of you as to what bike to go for, and what were the options at the time?
Dan, I know I've told you off, but you are allowed to speak.
Was there a debate? I think there wasn't a debate as such. I think there just wasn't an edict that we both had to be on the same bike. First time round, we were very green. It was our first trip. We hadn't done kind of more normal overlanding trips beforehand. The first time we'd gone overlanding by motorcycle, other than staying in European hotels, was was heading down through the length of Africa on Africa Twins. So we learned an awful lot on that. It made sense for the simplicity to both have the same bike, because then we could research the weaknesses of that bike and prepare for the weaknesses of that bike, and then we knew what we were doing with either of the two bikes. That just made sense. But then the second time round, I think we just felt more confident. We definitely both wanted to go lighter. Was borne out really early on in what we refer to as the Siberia trip, but the bulk of it wasn't in Siberia, but the Siberia trip, if you will. We commented regularly that being on little bikes, it just felt like cheating. It was so much easier being on small, lightweight bikes.
Tell us about the choices then that you made in the end.
Choices that we went with in the end. So I went with a DRZ 400, and Ed had a WR250R. Ed's bike was like a little jewel of a machine. I mean, they are such lovely, lovely little bikes. The WR250R, people who are not familiar with it, it is a trail bike, not an enduro bike, but it is a beautifully made, beautifully engineered thing. So
sort of ahead of its time, wasn't it? A little bit, just in terms of, I think, the quality and the cost, and that those sorts obviously no one really wanted to buy them full price because they're very expensive to start with, and partly because they were fuel injected. They'd actually been designed to be sort of minimalist and thin and small and light, rather than organically arrived at over decades of refining DRZs from refining loosely, but but this was designed from the ground up, if you like. It was supposed to look like the trail bikes, but be a little bit more like a road bike. And it is really, it's very roady, but you can it's very revvy too, which doesn't really lend itself to a great dirt bike, but it's light and it's reliable, fuel injection, and quite simple really, and compact. And so it's a really good find. Not to say I didn't have trouble with it, but I think that was part of the reason why I ended up with that, is partly because of the go lighter thing. And also I think I kind of let rip on the Siberia trip in terms of, it's going to be exactly kind of obsess over the bike, which actually is a complete undoing in many respects. But it was like, if I'm going to do it, I want the bike this way, I want it to look this way, I want this kind of luggage. It wasn't so much of like just that first go that we had in Africa, which was very successful. This was more like, let's just throw everything at it, partly because I was sat in an office and a bit bored and was thinking about this trip. And of course I was looking at originally doing it on my own in some way, although I secretly knew I was going to be able to persuade Dan at some point. But at that point he was getting on with his life and didn't really want to go on a trip. And then I think I just turned up the wick and started selling, I think.
How much time was there between getting back from Africa and setting off on this next trip?
3 years, I guess. 3 years between arriving back there. Yeah, because I think we got back from Africa in like February 2008, and I think I left. I left on the Siberia trip in April 2011.
There's a story there, I'm sensing.
There is a story there. It's very much related to the bike choice, and it shows how much more chaotic the start of the second trip was than the first. Really, I'd selected this DRZ, which I'd bought this thing probably with, I don't know, maybe probably about 10 months before we set off, something like that, so that I could really audition it, and because I think a big part of the bike choice for the first trip was that we'd both come from a sports bike background. We'd both gradually worked our way up through bigger and bigger road bikes. So a big adventure bike is a pretty natural choice if that's your riding background. It's far more familiar than a little dirt bike. I was like, well, I'm not sure how I'm going to get on with a lighter bike. I like the idea of a lighter bike. It makes so much sense. But I don't know how I'm going to get on with it. How harsh is it going to be riding along at 60 miles an hour on a single cylinder dirt bike? What's that going to feel like? So I thought, well, I'll buy a DRZ and try it out. So I bought a DRZ and tried it out, and it was good. I liked it. I rode it up to Scarborough to watch a mate of ours racing at the Oliver's Mount meet up there, and I broke my ankle. He was fine. I broke my ankle while spectating at Scarborough at Oliver's Mount, and then rode back with a broken ankle. And even with the broken ankle, the DRZ was fine. So at this point, it was still as a DRZ 400 SM guy. So it was still running road tyres. So it was a bit smoother on the road than maybe it would be on dirt wheels. But I deliberately started with the SM because it was slightly stiffer suspension. And I thought, well, that's going to work better once it's laden. We're going to go light, but it's still going to be, I'm a relatively big bloke and the luggage is going to add to that. So starting with a slightly more stiffly suspended bike was going to be a good way forward.
You set off on this trip before Ed?
Yeah.
Why was that?
So we set off together and we got as far as the Nürburgring, I think. I think Ed had lost the feeling in his hands and his feet.
I think what's interesting was you have to be a little bit careful of your own enthusiasm, because from my position, I wanted to do it a certain way, and actually these things should be in balance. There should be Zen involved in some way with the whole process. And I was very much more. Dan and I spoke in Africa, Chip, about we were bikers who liked to travel rather than travelers who had bikes. So we were always quite in orbit around motorbike culture and the riding of the bike as much as traveling and seeing stuff. So the two are happy bedfellows, but at the same time, we were as much about stuff and bikes and riding bikes and all that cool stuff.
Yeah.
And everything else was a bonus. You get to ride your bike for months and go and ride it everywhere and have a great time.
Really cool.
So anyway, so it was naturally then for Siberia that take that to the next level. Now you know what it's about. What are you going to do? And so I was just like, this is amazing. I'm just going to go crazy. So what I did was I effectively, just created a monster in my garage, and I took a very smooth, well-mannered, just a beautiful little bike, and somehow I managed to piss it off, and it developed this vibration. Just couldn't fix it. So it went from just over the winter between when I started pulling it apart and when I was ready to leave for the trip, because I didn't do a lot of shakedowns in the trip, guys, because it took so long to assemble the bike, and partly was the front rally fairing off the Hondas, like Noel's bike.
Off a rally.
That got incorporated into the front because it sort of could be made to fit, but with hindsight it was just a terrible idea, and just showed that although I thought I knew something, I really still knew nothing. So this is why we had this false start all ready to go. I was a little bit concerned about the vibration. Set off, I got to Germany, and it was just like, there's no way I'm riding this bike around the world. There's something wrong. I need to go back and fix it. So rode it home. And we were both rode home, having only got to the Nürburgring, and spent the night there and rode back. And then we just had to get a plan B, really, which is where we sort of diverged for a month or so. Was it a month? Probably.
I think it was about that, wasn't it? I forget exactly what the timescales were, but yeah, it was a false start. We both headed home because it was like, well, you obviously you got your work cut out.
How were you about this, Dan? Were you very kind of, oh yeah, that's fine, yeah, just a month off our amazing trip?
I was okay, I think. Obviously, it's a setback. Obviously, it's annoying. If you've set off on a trip with a mate, you don't want to watch that mate be miserable for 4 months.
Noel would.
And actually, in fairness, if I was traveling with Noel, yeah, probably I'd just accept that I was going to watch Noel be miserable for 4 months, because that's Noel.
At the point where you turn around, do you know what the solution is to making your bike friendly again?
Well, there were a couple of options, weren't there?
Yeah,
there was a spare bike.
There was a range. At that point, we were only a couple of days into the trip, so we'd actually I think it was the second night, really.
Yeah.
We stayed in the campsite outside Nürburgring, and then we stayed there while we tried to fix it, and then we headed back. So actually, we were really only a couple of days away from. And you were in the south coast at that point, were you, Dan? You were still.
Yeah, I'd been contracting at JCB, so I basically headed back to my folks in Winchester because I had nowhere else to go at this point. My final prep for the trip had been done at my folks' place in Winchester, and that's where I'd set off from.
So what do you do? Do you fix it, or do you exchange it for this mysterious other bike?
I then started trying to fix it, and then obviously time was ticking by. So I think after a week or so, obviously Dan was like, well, why don't I get on the road, basically? And we sort of thought, well, is that the end of the trip, or is that going to work? And we're pretty confident around Europe just in general, so it wasn't going to be an issue as such. So it was like, yeah, it's just Europe, we'll just drive up, catch up kind of thing. But then it started taking a bit longer. So I explored one of the BMW Cross X challenges or whatever. I explored a Suzuki, again, the DRZ. Went through, obviously there were was it Carnes? Yeah, there was all sort of insurance anyway, all sorts of things that had to be sorted out. Even got a DRZ, put a big tank on it. I was just like, I'm not sure I want to ride this. I know that sounds bad, but I think it was all partly because the WR it's so modern and it just spoiled me. And I was just like, this is not what I had in mind. So in the end, I went back to the WR, made a few tweaks to it, kind of got it back to roughly. I found some workarounds, and funny enough, the hand guards made it worse. So I kind of got into a situation where on the road, I would kind of swap off the hand guards. So for longer distances, I've got like bar end weights and stuff. That's one thing I got off the DRZ was the heavy bar end weights.
But I think a lot of people would have just tolerated it, wouldn't they? That's quite something that you just wanted to fine tune it that much.
Well, no, it was pretty bad.
Have you tried a pee under your mattress?
So anyway, I got back on the WR, got my ass back and caught up with Dan. But yeah, for a bit it was like, it was a little bit.
How far had you got, Dan, before?
I think we met back up in Turkey. And it worked pretty well for me, if I'm honest, because as Ed says, we were both really perfectly comfortable, as most people would be, just traveling around Europe. It's no harm traveling around Europe. That's all really easy going. And you're just getting more and more to know your bike and enjoying being on your bike. What's not to like? So I had a leisurely trip eastwards across Europe. I visited bits that Ed then didn't have a chance, really didn't really have time to explore. So I visited the Danube Delta in Romania and all sorts, and went on a little boat trip and looked at the birds. Genuinely, I had a really chilled time, a really nice time. Yeah. And actually, there are the aspects where it's quite nice traveling alone sometimes, because you actually meet people in a way that you don't when you're traveling with a mate, because you're more approachable. So you stay in a campsite, and because you're on your own, people feel that they're not intruding on your conversation if they come over and have a word. So I met loads of friendly people heading across Europe.
I get really confused when people go on bike trips and then they'll, like you just said, you went on a boat trip and things like that. I find that really confusing. So I was watching the guys do that across America trip. What I don't understand is you're on a bike trip and you think, I'll have a day off the bike and go for a hike, or I'll go and, go
this is the dream. This is the dream.
I just want to ride my bike.
Oh, for fuck. Come on.
But you're going to have 4 months of that. You get 4 months of riding your bike.
Yeah. Haven't you found whenever we've gone away, there's always kind of been that talk of this fabled day where we'll just have a day off, or we'll just do this cloverleaf thing from the campsite, and it never happens.
We did it once. We stayed at that campsite with a river and John went fishing.
Oh, come on. We got there early one day. So we had 2 extra hours lounging around by our tents. That wasn't a day off.
I thought we'd stayed there 2 nights.
No, we've never done that. Never,
but I just don't get it. If I go on a bike trip, I want to ride my bike. I don't want to go fucking sightseeing. Go and visit a church. Fuck's sake.
When you're on your own, there's stopping off. It's whenever you feel like it. When you're in a group of 2, 3, 4, 5 people, there's that feeling of making progress. You feel like taking a break is never going to be. It's not going to resonate with anyone at that everyone at that one moment. So I completely see.
You can take a break, but I'm not going on a fucking boat trip with you. I'll just stay in the hotel or stay in my tent.
So it doesn't hold any appeal to you whatsoever?
No, I'm on a bike trip. I'm going to ride my bike. I don't know. I've never done it for 4 months.
Well, it's a time thing, isn't it? Because you've always had limited time, so you've decided
that's another huge factor. If you've got a 1 week pass away from your family to go and ride your bike, then absolutely, I completely get it. You are on that bike as much as you can, probably 16 hours a day. Just ride it, fit new tires, ride it some more. But if you've got 4 months and, dare I say it, you're waiting for your mate to leave the UK still, then why would you not just chill out? And I think actually there is a balance. So I think Ed's touched on it already. We consider ourselves motorcyclists who happen to be traveling rather than travelers who happen to be using motorbikes.
So I'm surprised to hear you say that, because I would have said you were the other way around, because I think we need to divert slightly and talk about the fact that outside of this traveling, you're really not motorcyclists, are you? Certainly not now.
I'm not now, but then I was. My bikes were my daily transport. And this is the thing, they always had been. My friends based down in Sussex, loads of them would know me as Biker Dan. I just went everywhere on a motorbike. If I turned up at someone's house, I wanted someone to put my helmet when I got there. I never went anywhere in a car. I had rubbish cars, and I had bikes that meant the world to me.
You once said something to me that has haunted me ever since. And I wish you'd never said it. But you said that there came a point where you didn't want to be defined by your motorcycle. You sort of just mentioned it there, really. That and that sort of has happened to me.
Should I leave? Should I?
Because if I see people that I haven't seen for a while, one of the first things they'll say to me is a bike related. Well, have you been away on a bike?
Yeah.
So it's kind of happened to me in a way, and I'm not sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But I just remember you saying you didn't want it to happen to you.
Well, it wasn't a conscious decision that, right, that's it. People think of me as being a motorcyclist, so I'm going to stop. It wasn't explicitly, I am sick and tired of people asking me about what motorbike I've got and me having to blather on for hours about what I've got and how much I love it. I'm sick of it. It was just that, there was more to life. There's other things that are also entertaining. And, motorcycles were very much part of my life. And then actually, it took me by surprise after we got back from the Siberia trip. I ended up moving to the Midlands, had a single garage, which initially was full of motorbikes, and then one of them got nicked out of the garage. That was annoying. And then, I bought a classic car, and then that went in the garage, and that meant that my motorbike was trapped behind it. So if I wanted to ride my motorbike, I had to move my everyday car off the driveway, move the classic car out of the garage, get the bike out, put the classic car back in the garage, put the car back on the driveway, and ride my motorbike. And that life's too short, so I just didn't ride it. It pains me to say it, but that fundamentally is why I stopped riding my bike. That's why that I've never sold it. I've still got it. I still have a daft emotional attachment to it. I don't want to sell it, but it doesn't get used a lot. It's trapped in the garage here.
You've got a KTM in the garage, haven't you, Ed?
I kind of kept going in two ways, really. One was, so I don't really get that, the emotional attachment. So I've always sold all the bikes that I ever had because I kind of felt that, I kind of didn't feel that was, for me, felt very positive to be kind of obsessing over this thing that was getting older and more decrepit and kind of, I'm not very good at that. So I'd always shift them on because then that kept me kind of looking for the next thing and something and considering new things. And that was the idea anyway. But of course, over time, the thing, obviously dirt bikes. So I've carried on riding kind of enduro-y style bikes off road doing days because it's so convenient. It's local, it's a good workout, it's bikes and just having fun. But I don't tend to ride it on the road because now when I have road bikes, I've dabbled. I've had another WR, which I bought, and I didn't like this one particularly either, funnily enough. I had like ZXRs that I used to have when I was younger, and I didn't like that. And I think partly just the environment of the road has changed, and there seem to be less bikers around just generally. There are more cars, completely blacked out, faceless, SUV boxes going at 80 miles an hour everywhere. And it just doesn't really, there's not quite as much fun, even like the twisty roads and stuff. Just for me, I was just like, actually, you know what? I can't be bothered with that anymore. And also I had like scooters and stuff to get into the station. So I was always an all-weather scooter rider, if you like, for getting into London and stuff. I'd always have a scooter. I still got one. I've still got an SH300, which is perfectly decent. I mean, it's got a 250 dirt bike engine in it, I think, from the Suzuki, but it's as far removed from one as it can be. But anyway, that just sits there and doesn't really do a great deal because obviously post-pandemic, there's not a lot of travel to do.
Right. Look, sorry, I've diverted you. Let's get back to Ed.
No, I think that's fair enough. I mean, once I caught up with Dan, to segue back into it, the trip really started proper for the combined, Ed Dan thing. So off we went, really. Back on track, really, and that was the Charlie Ewan was back on track. Also, I just wanted to add one thing just before we move off it. Just the motivations. Believe it or not, one of the things which I had in my mind when I was planning the trip was, and this will seem absolutely ridiculous, but at the time it seemed kind of doable, was I'd been following the Moto Siberia guys, and they had got inflatable raft things that they took on their bikes, so that when they got basically once you get past Magadan,
like a pack
you're in either the rivers or you're on beaches because riding around. So it means you have to constantly cross like little rivers and cross very small bits of water all over the place. In my mind, to get to Kamchatka, which was what I originally thought, because I'd seen people riding in Kamchatka. I think I'd seen some bloke riding Africa Twin in Kamchatka, which of course is that peninsula south of Siberia, the most eastern part of Russia there. And there's no road obviously getting there. You'd have to fly in there or take a ship. But the idea was to kind of in the back of my mind see what it would be like to get out there and see whether something would be doable once I got there. But the reality proved very different. But it was a nice idea. And I even rang up some bloke who makes like rubber raft stuff and got him to quote me for these sort of things and thought about it.
You did. I remember seeing the quote and thinking that's quite something. You're very much in danger of losing Clive here because it's turning into a boat trip.
Back in the water.
But did the blokes you were watching, they bought pack rafts or something?
No, they had designed these, they looked like half a rib, basically, that they tied on either side of the bike and off they went. I've since seen much better attempts at it, but obviously a boat's a boat and a bike's a bike, and I think that's just
to find a better attempt at turning a bike into a boat.
Yeah.
What does that
I
look
have more
like?
fun watching them just have a really amazing attempt at it, and they got all the way out there, and but sense prevailed. I think it would have got very dangerous and full, and they were on KTM 400s at the time. And obviously the WR looks like a dirt bike, but is about 20 kilos heavier than a dirt bike, and that's significant.
Tell us what route you took, because there are a number of ways you can go once you kind of leave Western Europe, isn't there?
We didn't take quite the same route across Eastern Europe, I guess. Because I think, Ed, you took a slightly more direct route, didn't you? So I ended up heading across to Austria, and then from Austria, Romania, and then down through Bulgaria to Turkey.
I went through Hungary and then into Romania, but just straight into Bulgaria pretty much. Had like a day in Romania.
Whereas I really quite enjoyed Romania. It was such a contrast after Austria. It's really tidy.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's like the UK with bigger hills, but and I kind of know what I mean by that, in that it's really familiar. If anything, it's tidier than the UK.
Oh God, yeah.
But the scenery is just, the Alpine scenery is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. It's a gorgeous place. Romania has very similar. In terms of the natural scenery, there's some absolutely stunning vistas, but of course that it doesn't have the money. I mean, Austria is a really wealthy sort of place, and Romania famously isn't. So the contrasts were absolutely astonishing, and once again, we're back to what we were talking about last time, where we were talking about you sort of have this kind of audit trail. You've left your house, you've set off from there, you've watched the world change. You arrive in Romania and you're like, yeah, this is pretty different. There's an awful lot of, are those old Renaults? No, they're not.
They're towed by horses.
My experience of arriving in Romania, I just remember and the difference, because you're in sort of scenery mode, you're looking off the bike at all the scenery and everything, and it's Austria and place absolutely beautiful. I got to Romania, there's this amazing hill with this sort of castle ruins on the top. I thought that's just amazing, sort of real national trust kind of amazing thing. And the next minute, someone on a dirt bike ripped straight up the front of the hill, just like roosting all the way up to the top. And I was just like, this is a completely different thing. Like, there seems to be no, and I've spoken to some people since in Romania, and so they're just like, yeah, it's there. Let's take advantage of it. So,
but why did you go south of the Black Sea via Turkey and not through Ukraine?
I fancied seeing Turkey. I fancied going that route. I liked the idea of going through Iran. We touched on it really briefly earlier. Actually, I had ended up doing a little bit of contract work at JCB Power Systems, and whilst I was there, I had befriended a really, really nice Iranian chap. It was like, oh yeah, if you go through Iran, you must meet up with my family. And I was like, that sounds awesome. Why wouldn't you? Meet up with some people who will kind of put you up for the night and maybe show you around where they live. That's an interesting thing. I'm sorry, Clive, you won't be riding bikes, but you can look around somewhere that that's new and interesting. Really start to get a feel for somewhere. And Iran is one of those places where it's a really unusual place for a Brit particularly to go and visit. Relations between the UK and Iran are pretty fraught. The Iranian authorities are the worst bit of Iran, and they particularly hate Britain.
And what was it like at the time for you travelling through it? Were there many restrictions, or you didn't have to be accompanied or anything?
So this was 2011. So we were there in 2011, and I guess we were probably there in about May time, was it? The vast majority of our time in Iran was phenomenal. We met really, really lovely people. So yeah, we met up really early on. We met up the family of my colleague from JCB. And we spent, I forget how long with them, maybe 2 or 3 days. It felt like quite a long time, but I don't think it was that long. And they showed us around their local town, and that was really, really interesting. That gave us a really good insight into what life was like. And we had we could kind of chat to them openly about what Iran was really like. And then after a while, we were like, right, okay, yeah, we need to move on. We need to go and see some more of Iran and make our way forward. So we left them behind and headed towards Tehran ultimately. And I think that was. Did we end up getting our Turkmenistan visas in Tehran? Was that why we needed to go to Tehran? I think it maybe was. There, we met purely by chance. We were looking for some oil for the bikes. And we found a chap who was running a kind of an auto parts store at the side of the road in Tehran. Wandered in to find out what oil he was selling and see if we could get something that would work for the bikes. And got chatting to him, and he was like, he was really keen to talk to us because he could see the bikes, he could see that we were obviously traveling through, and everyone we met in Iran was astonished to meet a tourist. They loved the idea of people visiting their country. Their country's stunning. And this chap sort of invited us in and showed us pictures of his Land Rover. He had a bright bright orange Land Rover Defender that he absolutely adored taking to far-flung parts of Iran. He ended up giving us some GPS waypoints and was like, if you really want to see some unusual places in Iran, try going here and here. You could maybe go there, but that might be a bit tricky. That's a long way from your route. But these two, go to these places. So we did. And we left Tehran. We'd got our visas and left Tehran behind and headed out into the wilds in Iran and had an astonishing couple of days exploring two very different bits of scenery. The first place that we'd been given as a waypoint by our man, whose name has completely deserted me, but the first place was kind of some salt flats in the desert. We went out and explored this place, and there were some sand dunes by these salt flats, and we just kind of explored this kind of landscape of kind of dusty roads and camels and salt flats and sand dunes, and camped on the sand dunes, and no one bothered us. We saw some people on our way out there, but we didn't see. We probably before we camped, we hadn't seen anybody for maybe 3 hours, probably, before we stopped and camped. That's how remote we were. The next day, we packed up and headed off to the next waypoint, which was up in the mountains. And again, we headed up to the top of this mountain. The view was absolutely phenomenal. And again, we maybe passed some people on this gravel road up the side of this mountain. We may pass some people maybe a couple of hours before we stopped to camp, and then didn't see anybody else until the following day. And it was just immaculate, absolutely immaculate scenery, just completely unspoiled. Amazing view. You just felt completely on top of the world. We were hugely buoyed up by this. We were like, wow, this is just the most amazing place to visit. Phenomenal. So the next night we were like, well, we're heading towards the border. Let's just try our luck. We'll kind of head on the main road. Off we go. And then, when it's getting late in the day, we'll just head off the main road and just find ourselves somewhere quiet to stay. And so we kind of headed off up this mountain track, and the track kind of went across a field, and it got pretty narrow and pretty rocky, and then it carried on, and we got to this bit. We weren't that far at this point from a village that we'd gone through, but when we stopped in this field to camp, there were some people offering to help us find some water and being really friendly. I mean, we didn't speak a word of Farsi, they didn't speak any English, but we kind of understood what they were offering us, and they understood that, yes, we'd like some water, that would be lovely, thank you very much. And equally, they understood that we wanted to stay, and we understood that they were saying it was okay for us to do so. So it was all great. So we set up our tents, and that was great. Had a pleasant evening watching the sun go down, settled into bed. Everything was fine until quite a long way after dark, when, I don't know, did we hear rifles being cocked outside the tent? No shots fired, but certainly some pretty angry people. Yeah, straight away we were into the other side of traveling through Iran, and it was our first dealings with the authorities in Iran. We were in this phenomenally fortunate position of having the contacts of my colleague Changiz. His family had given us mobile phone numbers, and so his sister is still living in Iran, or was then. I assume she still is now, I don't know. And so we had his sister's phone number. So in the middle of the night, we've got people trying to talk to us in Farsi. Suddenly this kind of peaceful night's sleep has been somewhat spoiled.
Were they uniformed then?
No, and that's the point. So the one and Narmin, my colleague's sister was very kind of clear on this, and had been right from the start. If they're in a uniform, they've got no power. You don't need to worry at all about the people in uniform. In Iran, the people you worry about, the people who haven't got a uniform, because those guys are the Revolutionary Guard. So basically, if they're police, they haven't got any power. Don't worry about them. It's only the Revolutionary Guard that you've got to worry about, and they don't wear uniforms. They also don't know how to read their own visas, which makes things a bit interesting, because they wanted to know what we'd been doing in Iran for 3 months, and we hadn't been in Iran for 3 months. Our visa was valid from 3 months before we were there. So, we had to explain to them how their own visas worked. The starting point really was to phone my colleague's sister in the middle of the night and say, look, we're so sorry to be bothering you in the middle of the night. These guys have woken us up in our tents, and they're shouting at us. Can you talk to them and find out what the problem is, and establish what we need to do? And so she did. She spoke to them, and then next time we spoke to her, she was saying, well, they're saying you've got to move on because they're saying there's dangerous wild animals. And I think we had seen maybe a couple of beetles. We'd seen nothing that would be even slightly threatening. they were saying, well, no, it's for your own safety. Tourists aren't allowed to camp. Got to stay in a hotel. It's really important. We're like, what? We sort of said, well, are we in trouble? And so she asked them. We handed the phone back to them. Are these guys in trouble? And basically the response came back, well, you're not at the moment. But if you don't go with them, you will be.
You had to go with them.
The upside of that piece was slightly comic, because getting up to that point, well, that's slightly very, was actually really quite hard work to ride up. The final bit was really steep. It was a sort of first, not quite second gear, like flat. If I stop here, almost like a hill climb, where if you stop, you'd have to try and turn around and go back to the bottom of this bit. So we managed to get all the way up to the top of this beautiful kind of strange curved hill that poked out at the top, and it was like beautiful views. And the thought of, I think midnight or whatever, 11, or when it was dark, the thought of trying to ride down this thing, having packed up, God knows what we left behind. I don't think we left anything, but it could have been packed up in the dark with these, guys there, and then drive down this thing. But the funny thing was, they had come up in some rickety old car, so they then had to go back down, except there was one of the guys with a stick who waving a stick around. He had to run down in front of us, so we were sort of.
Well, they hadn't been able to get the car all the way up, had they? They'd come up a point where they couldn't get the car any further, so they had to walk. So they'd had to park the car in the village and march up the mountain to kind of apprehend these terrible British spies who were camping peacefully in a field. It was quite daunting. I had to, struggle to put my contact lenses in. I'm blind as about without the contact lenses in. So for the first half an hour of these guys shouting at us, I couldn't even see them. But anyway, we kind of, there was this comical bit where they were on foot and we were on motorbikes. And they're like, well, how exactly are you escorting us down the, having apprehended us, how are you escorting us down the mountain? Given that obviously we can't leave our motorbikes up there. So we were kind of chasing them down the mountain with high beam on. Herding the Revolutionary Guard off the mountain.
And how far was it to the nearest hotel?
I don't know about the nearest one, but the one they took us to, because it was run by their mate, wasn't that far away, I guess. Once we got to the main road, was it maybe like a 5 or 10 minute ride from there? It wasn't far.
I want the story to end with you saying, and then we spent all night drinking together and we're still in touch to this day.
No. So the following morning, we were interrogated by the Revolutionary Guard in the hotel. So they'd stayed there too. Had they stayed there or had they come back? Maybe they'd come back. I think I got the less scary one, and I think Ed got more of a grilling than I did. For me, what had happened is we'd ridden through this village. Obviously, we'd been noticed. It's impossible not to be noticed in that situation. We were then not far from the village. If you then think about the position that puts those villagers in, if they are found by the Revolutionary Guard to have been harbouring a couple of foreigners in a field, they are in trouble. Quite reasonably, one or two of those villagers got in touch with the authorities and were like, there's some strange men in a field. So they dobbed us in, and I've no beef with them for that. I'm sure that's exactly what they had to do.
Exactly the same in our village here.
They dobbed us in, and then the Revolutionary Guard are in this position where they've been told there's some foreigners. So they have got to go and investigate, because if they don't, then they're in trouble. So they've obviously got to do that. So I don't really have any issue with them either. They were just doing their job, but the incompetence was phenomenal. There's an amazing paranoia, which again, given historic events, is pretty reasonable. Why would the Iranian Revolutionary Guard trust anybody from Britain? Yeah, of course they're suspicious of us. Of course they are. And I think I had underestimated that before we arrived. Our experiences up to that point in Iran had really, made any concern about that kind of thing just completely fall away. We were absolutely confident that we were just going to have an amazing experience in Iran. And for the most part, we did.
So we were at that situation by the end of the following day?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, probably by late morning. And I think we were probably interviewed. I think maybe mine was half an hour, 45 minutes. I think Ed's was quite a bit longer than that, maybe more like an hour and a half, 2 hours or something. Yeah. It was lengthy, but eventually you've explained why you're there. You've shown that you're there legally. They haven't found any evidence that you've been doing anything that you shouldn't be doing. Ultimately, they did end up being reasonable and letting us go. Because we weren't, and actually, this is the thing. I think if you were an Iranian national, if you were dual nationality, you'd be far more likely to be in trouble than we were.
You're still a hell of a long way from Siberia at this point.
And we've only got about half an hour left on the podcast, so
come back next week for part 3. No. How about I shut up and we go to Siberia?
No, it's all good. Turkmenistan next.
Turkmenistan is really quick.
Listeners, you should, while you listen to this, open Google Maps on your phone, and you can travel with the guides. It's a beautiful thing to do.
Turkmenistan is quick because Turkmenistan, there is no such thing as a tourist visa. So you get a transit visa. You specify where you're arriving, where you're leaving. You've got 5 days to get across, and that's it. No tourism, not allowed, not even the gas crater. So we just went to the gas crater, took our photos there, and then headed on. But yeah, it's Turkmenistan. What a place! It is pretty special. It is a proper cultish country. The president is an absolute Fruit Loop. It is quite something. The place that everyone's heard of is the place that we visited, which is the Darvaza gas crater, which is, I don't know, a few miles off the paved road out in the desert. It is an amazing place, and it kind of looks like it's. And my assumption is it's the result of a gas exploration gone wrong. They've drilled down to get to the gas, and they've released the gas into some porous rock, and then something's gone horribly wrong and it's gone kaboom. And then because the gas is out in the porous rock, you can't cap it off easily, so they've just left it burning ever since. And I think by the time we were there, I think it had been burning for about 50 years.
For listeners, this is the Darvaza gas crater in Darvaza, Turkmenistan.
The town of Darvaza, I believe, was demolished at the command of the president, who decided it didn't look modern enough for modern Turkmenistan, so he didn't like the look of it, so he had it demolished.
Right, so you're into Uzbekistan. No incident. The bikes are running fine.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Everything's going swimmingly at this point.
There was one thing which I just reminded myself on after the thing with the immigration officers, if you like, in Iran on our way out. So every now and again, you'd have the fuel tap scenario would happen.
Oh yeah.
And I think it's, according to the thing, that was the second time it had happened. I think it might have happened earlier in the trip as well. But there would always be some technical remedy that had to take place as a result of the fuel tap being left on.
So it's
kind of like a comic well, not comic, it's annoying, I suppose, for you especially. But every now and again, the tap would have been left on overnight.
That is true, and so that is a thing. I mean, I've said there were no issues with the bikes. That at this stage, there were no serious issues with the bikes. I mean, my DRZ was just being a DRZ, or more to the point, was being a DRZ with a big tank on it.
If I've got a bike with a fuel tap, I routinely turn it off at night because I'm just paranoid about the float sticking.
They were kept unstuck by a very steady stream of fuel the entire time, even if the bike wasn't running. There was always a steady flow of fuel through that carb directly into the cylinder, resulting in a hydraulic lock by morning. Thankfully, I had fitted a kickstart to my DRZ, basically just dragging it back to the dark area. And this was the embarrassment. So Ed had this jewel of an immaculately engineered WR250R, and I'd bought this thing with a carburettor on it, which I absolutely detest. I've always hated carbs. So it had a carburettor on it, and I'd fitted a kickstart, and Ed had mercilessly ribbed me for this. It was like, how often do you use the crank handle on your car? If you're going on holiday, do you fit a crank handle? No, don't. Oh, yeah, I take your point. But because this thing had a carburettor and in fairness to Suzuki, I had removed the vacuum fuel tap when I fitted the massive 28-litre tank. So it wasn't Suzuki's fault, it was my fault. And I would forget to turn off the tap because, I'm used to riding, kind of modern fuel-injected bikes. And even when I had bikes with carbs, they were reliable ones, didn't have an issue. I did frequently have to remove the spark plug and kick it over and get jets of fuel out through the spark plug hole before being able to start in the morning. So yeah, you're right. That did happen in Iran, didn't it? Yeah.
And were you sort of picking tricky routes and tricky roads, or were you on tarmac most of the time?
I think the trip itself was picking a tricky route. That was the whole point. So with the Africa trip, we'd been on big bikes because that's what suited us at the time. And that meant that we basically chose tarmac whenever we could, because otherwise it would, you'd never get there. Well, you would get there, but it would take you an awful long time. Whereas we were on small bikes, we could do something, we could go more interesting routes. So we did, and that was the nature of the trip. I mean, you wouldn't tackle the BAM road on an Africa Twin if you've only got my off-road riding ability. You wouldn't do it.
There's some real highlights, aren't there, in terms of on the route? I mean, clearly Iran was. I mean, Turkmenistan could have been really good, but as you said, the transit visa was problematic. It was very hot, a lot of very flat desert and stuff. But of course, it's Silk Road area, so there's lots of historical bits. It's quite touristy in places. Leaving Iran into Turkmenistan is the least good bit of it. But the rest of it's kind of interesting. It's pretty small though, and I suppose we also had our eye on the later bits of the trip as well. So it was just nice to be going through that place. But one of the reasons to answer the whole question about which way round we went going through Iran was also the commentary about Kazakhstan being flat and boring and all the rest of it had genuinely put me off the idea, and messing around and for ferries across the Caspian or whatever it was. So that had put me off that idea, and the Iran thing was just the perfect antidote really to that, because it's don't get the chance to do that on a motorbike very often, and with contact in the country, it was just it was
a golden opportunity. Actually, yeah, I think you've touched on something again that was that kind of informed how we tackled how long we spent on various bits of both trips. In that we both felt that if it was close to home, it would be really easy to go back. So if you found a bit of Europe that you wanted to really visit, well, you can go back another time. Now's not your opportunity to have a really good look around France. There's plenty of other times to go and have a look around France, but to go that route, when was going to be the next opportunity that I was going to go and visit Iran and as Ed says, and have contacts in the country and so on? That wasn't going to happen. Ed, what was the list?
We did Turkmenistan first. We did Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then Kazakhstan. Obviously Kazakhstan is vast as well, but anyway, I think those routes were very much around just following the path that presented itself to us. In places as high altitude, and bits of Uzbekistan were a little bit militarized and problematic to Fergana what's it called again? Fergana. And places like that are still kind of occupied and sensitive, and there were some other routes through Tajikistan, for example, where we were going on a bit that needed an extra permit, and so there wasn't a lot of thought of deviating, partly because the scenery's so amazing, the routes are amazing, phenomenal. You're already high altitude, lovely off-road kind of tracks everywhere. It was like everything that we wanted really. So we didn't do a lot of sort of perpendicular exploring, if you like. We just kind of meandered through and stayed at some nice places and carried on going really.
You guys have travelled now twice for a number of months together. I don't know how long was Africa and how long was this trip?
They were about the same length, I think. I think the Africa trip, I think, was about 4.5 months, and I think this one was too. I think they were both about of that order, 4.5 months, something like that.
How did you get on for those 9 months?
And we're still speaking now.
I think what happens at the end of a trip is it's kind of just luck of the draw, really, in terms of at the end of a trip where you end up going off to and what you end up doing. So obviously Africa ended up kind of slightly disjointed. I flew out and I was thinking about going and getting a job and all the rest of it. There was some just disparity in terms of expectation there. But during the travelling in Africa, we had a third party along with us for part of it.
Vast majority of it.
Well, yeah, actually from that perspective, yeah. So
like a leech you couldn't shake off.
Yeah.
You've
and
met
that
him.
was created a certain dynamic, which was good. But I think in the Russia trip, I said the Siberia trip, it didn't really matter. I think we kind of recognised that having that third element along was quite useful too, because it's an element of relief, light relief.
Well, yeah. I mean,
you know what I mean?
He's a really, really nice bloke.
2 questions. First for Dan and Ed. Who's your favourite, Ewan or Charlie?
Oh, Jesus.
All right, forget it then. If you're not happy with that, Noel, who's your favourite, Dan or Ed?
Dan and Ed aren't a television show. They're not a construct. They're real people.
I didn't know there were 2 people until we started doing this podcast. Well, Dan and Ed. It's like a Czech name or something like that.
I was going to say, did you meet up with other bikers? I know you met up with other bikers because you met Bernie from Germany, and I bumped into a guy in Iceland who happened to bump into you in Uzbekistan. And when Clive and I were traveling through the Netherlands, we bumped into a guy in Amsterdam who happened to know Bernie, who happened to know. It's so weird, isn't it?
Wow. And I was going to say we didn't meet as many other motorcyclists on this trip as we did in Africa. I think that is true. So I think maybe in the early, but we did meet quite a few people. Central Asia is pretty popular. There were quite a few people through there. We did meet other motorcyclists, I think, in Mongolia as well. But certainly in the Siberian bits, there's nothing like the traffic. Mongolia is an amazing place to go and visit. And people always bang on about there's no roads in Mongolia, but that depends on the definition of road. And by the time you've got there, you understand that a road is just wherever people travel, and Mongolia is full of roads. There's thousands of them. They're usually right next to each other. They're just, loads of ruts all going in the same way. They're all rubbish. None of the roads are any good, but there's loads of them. It's astonishing landscape to travel through.
Where did you end up? And how did you get back? Did you ride back or ship back?
We ended up in the furthest east was Magadan. So we ended up in Magadan. And then from there, we flew the bikes back to Moscow and then rode home from Moscow. That was the disjointed bit of this trip, actually. So we'd arrived in Magadan together.
But we have to ask, was Siberia every bit as grim as we might imagine it to be? Or not grim, but was it hard going?
Bits of it, yes. Bits of it, very much so, yeah. But then that was the point. It doesn't have to be. We'd made it that way. All of these trips. When you set yourself a challenge like this, it always ends up being a bit contrived. It doesn't have to be grim getting to Magadan, but we chose to make it hard work because then it feels like you've achieved something. It gives you a sense of achievement to have got there. So all of these trips end up being a little bit contrived. The easiest way to get to Cape Town is not to get on a motorbike. That's not how you get to Cape Town. That's contrived. All these adventures are contrived. Doesn't mean they're not worth doing. They are absolutely. They are an end. They're an end in their own right. But yeah, the bit of Siberia that we'd chosen, the routes that we'd chosen to take through Siberia was really hard work. There were certainly bits of that where I was starting to worry. What we'd bitten off.
Was it broken bridges and big river crossings?
Oh hell yeah, absolutely. And before we set off, I'd been absolutely bricking it about the Vitim River Bridge. For anybody who's not heard of it, is an old railway bridge that is really high, has no guardrails, has a kind of a railway sleeper surface. It's all very loose and there's gaps between some of them. It's pretty terrifying, actually. It's really long. It's something daft like 800 meters long. It's a huge river, and you're about 20 or 30 meters up from the surface of the water on the top of this bridge.
Do four-wheel drive vehicles cross it, or is it
four-wheel drives just fit? It is just wide enough for a four-wheel drive vehicle to drive along. It is not wide. It's quite that's quite a thing. In the event, that wasn't the biggest bridge challenge that I think we faced. I mean, I think there were my personal nemesis. I couldn't even tell you exactly where we were, but again, we'd come to a bit where the road. So and again, people who haven't heard of the BAM road, the BAM is the railway. It's the Baikal-Amur railway mainline, and BAM. The road was built in order to build the railway, but hasn't been maintained since in any meaningful kind of cohesive way. So yeah, bits of it are still in use, but the road as a route the whole way through has not been maintained. It doesn't need to be. It's served its purpose. And so there's plenty of bridges that are just missing now. So the railway is still in use. So the railway was a kind of Trans-Siberian that was further away from the Chinese border, and that was why it was built. So it was a little bit, if China invaded Russia, then the BAM still gave them a railway to the east. But the railway is still in use, but the road is not. So there's bits where you're doing a river crossing in the river, and if the river's not very big, that's okay. But if the river is big, then that's completely unfeasible. Then you've got two choices. You either wait for someone to arrive with a truck who might be able to put your bike in the back and over you go, or you get on the railway. And just saying that here from the safety of spare room, it sounds mental. It's a live railway. There's trains on it. You've seen it. And you're putting your motorbike on the railway and riding it along.
It's quite bumpy as well, isn't it?
It's pretty bumpy, yeah. Yeah, it's
really
pretty bumpy. Yeah. They haven't really thought about that. They haven't really catered for motorbikes. It's madness, and you're aware how dangerous this is. You've no idea when the next train is coming. You've no way of finding out. You manhandle your bike onto the railway and you ride along the sleepers. And
didn't you do the classic sticking your ear on the track to see if you could hear it?
It's quite difficult when you're riding your bike, though, isn't it?
Yeah, no, this is the thing. I mean, Clive wouldn't want you to get off your motorbike.
If I can ride your motorbike, you're not here for a train spotting,
exactly.
Mate.
Yeah, you're not here to listen to railway tracks. Yeah, get on your motorbike. So no, we. You could. I don't think we did. We never did.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of things you could actually. I mean,
timetables.
One of the things you could do. One of the things you could conceivably, the safest thing realistically to do, would be to wait for a train to come.
Yes.
And follow it.
Yeah.
that would be the safest thing to do, because they're such a long way apart.
Yeah.
There's only a single line, only a single track. So if a train is coming one way, there isn't one coming the other way, and they're not fast.
Can I just interrupt you a minute? I've just squirted a load of Oragel, which is like a dental gel, which just happened to be on my desk from when I had a toothache a while ago in my mouth, and half my mouth's now gone to sleep.
Why have you done that?
I don't know. I thought it'd be funny.
All right. So we've now got to watch you dribble.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, where were you?
Yeah.
Bam Road Railway.
Yeah.
So, well, I was going to say, did you drown a bike ever, and were you plied with vodka by passing lorry drivers and all the classic things happen?
Yes, and yes.
Next question.
Did you completely drown a bike, like submerged?
I threw my bike, into a very big puddle in Siberia in the Bam Road. And just the whole thing went in, and it just happened to be the time that I had my video camera in my tank bag, and not in a waterproof thing. So that was the end of the video camera. Obviously oil and everything with water, and then had to go back to the village. And I went back to the village and got 4 litres or something and ran it through it. So yeah, oh well.
Yeah, and in fact, it was shortly after that we got plied with vodka, wasn't it? I think it was shortly after that we got plied by vodka.
Yeah.
Plied with vodka by some friendly chaps in a truck who just turned up with a bottle of vodka and a carton of orange juice. So you had a swig of each. It was vodka and orange.
Cocktails.
Yeah, quite right.
And then warned us about the size of the bears as they drove off into the night, leaving us camping on the road.
Yeah. They're like, enjoy sleeping in your plastic bags. Plastic truck.
Did you hear any bears at night?
No, we didn't hear any birds.
At one point, so I suppose just if there's time, we did actually part company briefly during the trip. So when we left Mongolia, there was an issue with the DRZ, let's say, an inconvenience.
There was.
And which meant that I went on ahead because I wanted to explore the east side of Lake Baikal. So the Bam Road basically starts at the top of Lake Baikal, the road does, but you generally go up the west side of it, but there is dirt tracks up the east side of it that are supposed to be passable in some way, well at least. So again, this was another idea I had, and they have winter roads, the Ziminiks. Some of them are passable in the summer, but they're not roads as such, so they're just generally the shape of a road, but they're actually like rocks and trees and bad gradients and all the rest of it, so they're not really. So anyway, I did a little trip up the side and then came back down and caught up. But when I was up that side, I got to the end and found I couldn't really get through. I didn't feel that comfortable. It didn't seem that safe to go any further, but I was camping like in the middle of this on the east side of Baikal, which is quite a popular sort of tourist holiday place. They're staying in certain kind of camps, but outside of that it feels like really the Wild West. That is quite, you're really on your own. I could hear all sorts of strange noises that night, and so I will say that I hadn't been drinking, and B, I was very remote at that point from civilization, even though I wasn't that far across the lake, but I was definitely out on my own, and it was a little bit worrying. I was a bit kind of like, okay, this is where this is where the rubber meets the road, and planning to do crazy trips. So yeah.
As the end is in sight, are you are you ready for it to end, or do you just want to keep going? How do you feel as it's coming to a close? That's
a really good question. A bit of me just wanted to fly on from Magadan. Where can we go from here? So yeah, a bit of me wanted to just continue, but at the same time, the bikes were pretty tired by then. And actually, I think actually what really did for mine, once mine had got its shiny new stator fitted in Mongolia, that had been flown out from the UK and fitted in Ulaanbaatar whilst Ed was off, dancing with the bears in Siberia. What my bike was then, it was running okay, but both bikes took a real beating getting to Magadan. It's really wet. You're going through a lot of really wet terrain. We got to Magadan. There's nowhere else to go. We parked the bikes up and started looking into getting them crated up and flown back to Moscow. So they sat still for probably a week while we organised getting them back to the west. We did chill out and drink some beer, and we tried to get the bikes palletized and ready to be flown back from Magadan to Moscow so that we could ride home. And I think it's during that time that the wheel bearings in the DRZ, I think they corroded at that point, because shortly after setting off from Moscow, my wheel bearings started to fail. Both bikes had a hard time. They were all right, but they'd had a hard time my plan had been to, I thought on my way back, because again, we were traveling home. So there'd been quite a bit of traveling separately for short periods, actually, on this trip. There were bits where we were out of sync as to who had which visa from where. So I maybe needed to get a visa in a particular city and Ed didn't, so Ed would keep going for a bit and then I'd catch him up again. And actually one of those situations was a classic example of where a small bike is just the way forward, actually, because Ed had gone to Charin Canyon and he'd navigated there using a waypoint that someone had sent him for Charin Canyon. He sent me that waypoint and said, yeah, I'll see you at Charin Canyon. I was like, oh, cool. So I set off after him to get to Charin Canyon and thought the waypoint was where he was. Now, if you've seen The Long Way Round...
Several times.
So I know Clive loves The Long Way Round.
It's a favourite.
Yeah, so if you've seen The Long Way Round, there's a bit where they go to Charin Canyon on their massive BMWs, and they think, when they get there, they think, oh, look at this amazing canyon. Wouldn't it be great to explore that? And they jump on their bikes and they ride down into it, and then they cannot get out. They have an absolute nightmare getting out. And that's no disrespect to Charlie and Ewan. It's challenging getting big, heavy, fully laden, big bikes across that sort of terrain. They have an absolute nightmare. And at the end, you've got this kind of soul-destroying statement from Charlie or Ewan saying, well, the moral of the story is if you're doing these trips, you just don't go and visit things that you don't have to. You just don't. You just don't do it because it's just too much hard work. So that really is, that's the learning experience. Now, contrast that with the situation here where Ed's gone to Charin Canyon. He sent me a waypoint for the centre of Charin Canyon. He's camped up on the rim. He's camped up on the edge. I ride to Charin Canyon. I see I'm not at the waypoint yet. I ride down into the canyon, look for Ed, ride back out the canyon, looking for Ed, ride back into the canyon, looking for Ed, turn around, ride back out the canyon, looking for Ed, and eventually find Ed up on the top. And it's not been an issue at all. Fully laden on a DRZ with no off-road riding ability whatsoever. It's just like cheating. It's just so much easier being on a smaller, lighter bike. And the moral of the story is not don't visit places that are interesting that you don't have to. The moral of the story is very much do visit places, but take something that you can ride.
Preempted my next question, which was going to be if you did it again, which bikes would you choose? But you basically just said you're going to take some small trail bikes, aren't you, right?
Well, the natural progression is bicycle, isn't it?
No, don't do that. That's ridiculous.
So,
that's worse than a boat trip. You have to pedal. Ridiculous idea. We've got a mate that is currently cycling London, Edinburgh, London.
Non-stop.
Great idea. Lovely.
Oh,
Just getting a few hours sleep, and it's just like, just fucking stop.
Well,
A, stop. B, don't fucking do it.
it's Paul. Regular Paul.
so you're telling him to stop.
I haven't done.
He
No,
just,
we
he just
haven't.
wants to ride his
We're all,
bike.
we're all
being-
thinking.
He just wants to ride his bike, Clive.
We're encouraging
Let him
him.
ride his bike.
Oh.
Let him ride his bike. If you had your bike, you'd want to ride your bike.
No,
Let him
Yes,
ride his bike.
yes, that's true.
He doesn't want to do a boat trip. He doesn't want to do a
Twist
boat trip. He doesn't
throttle.
want to stop.
rather than
He doesn't
pedal.
want to stay in a hotel. He wants to ride his bike. Let him ride his bike.
He's riding his bike, all right.
What I just wanted to ask: do you know what the trip cost?
What did the trip cost? What do you even include in the cost?
The money that you spent.
Lost earnings.
No, I don't include that. No,
Mortgage
just cost,
payments.
no. Just what did the trip cost?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think it was that much.
Great information. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Sake.
yeah.
Where
thanks
do we
for your time.
find these guests?
It's a long time ago. I've slept since then. I seem to remember totting it up, and I think it was something daft, like about $7,000 or something like that.
Wow. I suppose for 4.5 months living, that's
So that was it. That was the duration for about 4.5 months.
Yeah, and I think that would include the cost of prepping the bike and all of that.
The
And,
shipping and the flying.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah, something like that.
Did we work out, Dan, just anecdotally, something about it cost as much to fly back as it did to drive out there? Something like that. The cost of petrol actually wasn't that great,
No.
for example. And we did a lot of
Yeah.
camping on this trip too.
Yeah.
Africa wasn't expensive either, particularly, but we stayed more like in auberges and things. Whereas this, we did a bit more camping, interspersed with kind of hotels that we would try and blag our way into, kind of thing. And I think it was the fuel back was similar to the flight back to Moscow or something like that. I can't remember what it was.
I think really the message with all these trips is actually they tend not to cost as much as you think they're going to, because the difficulty is if you're used to doing normal holidays, you spend an awful lot of time and money getting to where you're going and getting back again in a short space of time. You go a long way in a short space of time. And if you then just multiply that by 2 weeks, multiply that by 4 months, comes up to a lot of money. That isn't how it works.
A week or 10 days away is easily £1,000, isn't it? I would say an average holiday lasting that long is usually, in my experience, $7,000 for 4 months away is brilliant, isn't it?
It's really.
I actually created a monster spreadsheet, which I'm actually looking at the moment. Funnily enough, I love.
He's an enthusiast.
I've got just the visas bit here, just highlighting those. I had £698 on visas. So that was, we had a Russian multi-entry business, visa for Iran, visa service for Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Turkmenistan. Oh, that doesn't include Turkmenistan fees. So yeah, £750.
It's taken 10 years, but your spreadsheet has come in handy, hasn't it? You were right to do your little spreadsheet, weren't you?
It's funny, isn't it?
Spreadsheet Excel for the win.
And in the end, did the bikes sell for pretty much what you paid for them, or? And did you tell the seller, the buyer rather, what these bikes had done?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, WRs with, what do they have on it? 36,000 kilometers or something on it. I can't remember what it had on it, but they don't come up very often, so it was quite obvious. They looked like. And the other thing with bikes on chips is they come back looking like they've been shot blasted. It's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? Everything is just shot blasted.
But you didn't find that put off any buyers particularly?
No. So I think the chap who bought my DRZ liked the look of it because it was prepped for a trip and he wanted to go on a trip on a DRZ. So, it had the big tank, it had a luggage rack, which he ruined. Yeah, it was kind of ready to go.
I'd kind of written off the cost of the bike. I know that sounds kind of a little bit Mr. Moneybags, but in a way you have, because I kind of expected there's always a risk that the bike might not come back for some reason. And it certainly isn't going to come back looking anything like it did. You may treasure it for the qualities and the experience it gave you, but you're not going to treasure it for how it looks and how it works by the time you get back, because it's had a hard time.
And as you've already said, you didn't feel emotionally attached. At the end, I would have kept that bike. That was the bike I'd almost...
You would have kept it for about 3 months and gone, oh, I've got 500 quid sitting in the garage. You can't just leave it there. I've got to sell it.
But it never crossed your mind that you might want to keep this bike that you'd done this epic trip on?
Not for me. So I almost kept the DRZ. And with the Africa Twinner after Africa, I very much felt that I needed to sell it because I didn't want it sat there in my garage reminding me what I'd rather be doing.
I think now you've been on the UK's sometimes most popular motorcycle podcast, somebody's going to track it down and probably put it in a museum.
It seems very likely. I'm not sure if the VIN numbers of my old bikes are on Ed's spreadsheet. If they are, then we can maybe help people identify those.
Yeah, it's there somewhere.
Any other good stuff on your spreadsheet, Ed?
So the bikes that I considered, I had the Yamaha XT660 because I had one at one point, although I think they're dreadful off the road, but they are very dependable, if not slightly cheaply made for a Yamaha, quite frankly. I had the KTM 690 obviously on there. Again, these are the earliest ones, the earlier ones. Nice on the weight and the power. Had Africa Twin on it. I think that was just there as a control. I don't think that was ever intended.
As a comparison.
Had just to validate my lightweight bike. Yeah, but you could have had this. There was the BMW F800 GS. There was, which again, for some reason I sort of thought maybe. There was the KTM 990. Obviously the DRZ 400 and then the WR250R, and the weight just starts going down. So it starts off at like the Africa Twin is 207 on this or dry, 218 wet, and the WR250 is 134 wet.
While I'm thinking about this, Noel, we should probably do an episode on spreadsheeting for adventure travel.
Yeah. It was quite comprehensive though, with hindsight.
Yeah, sounds it.
Anyway, I think what usually happened, I started off and I had a spaces for the trip as it went through, but actually, of course, you're not there to do spreadsheets. So again, that just disappeared out the window. The planning to get there, it did come in handy. I mean, you could even on this one, I had the difference in the fuel consumption for anticipated bad roads. I mean, it's almost like looking back at yourself and going, what was that bloke thinking? Who is that bloke? He has way too much time on his hands. Yeah. He quite frankly should have thought a bit more about not messing around with a perfectly lovely WR and breaking it, and actually planned a few more things to see on the way. That probably would have been a better way of doing it.
Do you think you'll ever do anything like this ever again?
And can we come?
Well, I'm hankering after another down, but I think the biking side of things and America, I'm not so sure. I've worked in America. I've lived in America very briefly, and travelled a bit. North America doesn't.
No,
it's its own thing.
It is its own thing. It's easy to visit. I mean, North America is phenomenal. I've had the privilege of working in the US for test trips, taking vehicles on test trips in the US, and some of the locations in the US are completely mind-boggling. And when you visit bits of the US, you can understand why people don't bother leaving the US. If you live there, there's so many amazing places you can see within the US. You can understand why people don't bother leaving. So the US is its own thing. It's all very accessible. It's all very easy to visit. So it doesn't require a big trip to go and visit it. If you do the length of the Americas, you are doing that in order to have done the Americas, not in order to have a means of seeing North America. I think I came back from the Siberia trip thinking, yes, the next one is the Americas north to south. Alaska to Ushuaia, that's the thing to do. I'd love to do it. And a bit of me would still love to do it. I don't know when that could ever happen or what form that might take. My wife is really, really envious of the trips. She would love to do some proper travel in inverted commas. So maybe in 20 years' time, when the kids have left home, maybe that's something that we'll do, but it won't be on motorbikes.
My parting thought on that is that I think also slightly the romanticism of the trip concept has met the reality of it. We're just lucky with the Siberia trip that almost it ended at the best bit, which is kind of how you want things to end. You had the BAM road, you had Siberia, and it was the bit that I was looking forward to, and it didn't disappoint. It was tough, and the bikes were great and all that sort of stuff, and we had great stuff before then. A little bit like with the Africa trip, got to South Africa. When you get into Namibia in South Africa, it's like being back in use the whole term the first world, but it's like being back at home. It's all so much more, it's almost like the trip's over and you still got all these places familiar to see. So I think if there was going to be another trip, I would resist the theatre of a massive trip, because it's inefficient in time. You spend a lot of time traveling between those, which has its benefits, don't get me wrong. But I think I don't necessarily have that one big trip thing for multi months, because it was just so inefficient. And I know the anticipation is great, and that's part of a trip as well as anticipation, because you're waiting weeks to experience that thing, and you're putting in the hard time in the saddle, aren't you? Especially on a dirt bike, these things, sitting on that for a couple of months, you sure know about it. So I think there's just some learning. I feel a little bit wiser in certain aspects, and I think I'd probably focus the money on the thing that I really wanted, rather than trying to create the sellable theatrical story. But I look back and I love the story. I love the Africa story. I love the Siberia story. Wouldn't change it for the world. I think just realistically, it would be hard to sell. And maybe it'll come again. It'll come back.
I think it's a kind of where you're at in your life. I think can you make it fit? So I think I firmly believe that the vast majority of people, I won't say everybody, but the vast majority of people, the only thing stopping them going on a trip is themselves. The people, loads of people say, oh, I'd love to, but I can't. And actually what they're really saying is, I kind of like the idea, but I don't want to do it enough that I actually want to go through the inconvenience of doing it. Because you're taking a risk. And I'm not saying that it's easy for everyone. And I think, both Ed and I would agree that we both speak from a position of privilege. We've both feel immensely privileged to have been in a position to be able to go and do these trips, and it hasn't ruined our lives. It hasn't, set us back in our lives, in our careers or whatever. We've kind of got away with it, and that's awesome. And that we are very, very lucky to be in that position. But I genuinely believe that an awful lot of people are in that position, even if they don't realise they are. But I think that I'm no longer in that position. I think Ed's no longer in that position. So I think once you've got family commitments, it's much harder. I'm not saying it's impossible. We met people on the road traveling as a family, not in Siberia, but in Africa. We met European families. I'm sure we met a Dutch family in the Gambia or somewhere, I think. And all at that point, all of their kids had malaria. They were traveling as a family, because in their minds, whilst the kids were young, they were still kind of in the first bit of primary school, probably.
They saw that as a perfect
younger
time.
And they were like, well, there's never going to be a better time. There's never going to be a better time than now. Whereas for Ed and I at the time, it's like, we don't have commitments. There's never going to be a better time. So,
and people were, they weren't openly disparaging, but in the sense that you got all of the usual resistance. Why are you doing that now? What about your career? Like, why are you giving up doing this and all that? And
why not paying off your student loans?
There is no time better than now, because and it proves itself. Life it doesn't necessarily get harder, but it just gets busier. There's
it's good that, it's still good that you recognise that, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm so pleased with my earlier self for just saying, sod it, chuck the job in. I had a great job working in the city for the Siberia trip, and I was like, no way. I know, yeah, if you wait around, then you're going to regret it. And
this is the thing. I mean,
so pleased we did it.
We were we were by no means the youngest people, going traveling when we went on highway. We were we were 30 when we did the Africa trip, and we were kind of 33, 34, or however old we were doing the Siberia trip. There are people doing these things in their 20s, and all power to them. That is the thing. There's never going to be a better time. There's never going to be a better time than now. Do it.
There we go. There's never going to be a better time. Do it. I love that last bit. That makes really interesting listening. I'm sure you'll agree. 2 amazing episodes with Dan and Ed. Just fantastic storytellers. Really enjoyed recording those, and I hope you enjoyed listening to them too. Anyhow, we've got another cracker coming up next week, if I can edit it on time. Noel and I get into a big bike argument with Ollie Moto and Jason HP2 Mav. I think they might win as well, actually. But we'll call it a draw. In fact, I did call it a draw. Please keep sharing the podcast with your biking buddies. And if you could, it would be really good if you could give us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps. Thanks a lot. See ya. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.